Today we're honoured to have Dr. Michael Wagels from Brisbane, Australia. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for coming on board. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind telling the audience a little bit about your professional background, perhaps starting from when you finished medical school and where you did that.
Yeah. I'm a plastic and reconstructive surgeon by trade, Stephen. So from the point of finishing medical school to there is something of a journey. And I'll tell you now, I wasn't in a hurry. And I think that's probably been a good thing for me. I established an interest in research even before I'd left medical school. I did an undergraduate research degree, lazily looking at a project related to lower limb trauma for about 12 months between my penultimate year of medical school and my final year of medical school. And then I spent some time, once I'd finished medical school, actually traveling, as I was counseled heavily against doing, well, with the idea being that it somehow messes with your career progression. I just didn't believe that. So my now wife and I went to Cork in Ireland, worked there for 6 months, and then bought a van and cruised all around Western Europe. Had a really, really very memorable experience. We still talk about it. So back to Brisbane after that, and yeah, it was time to knuckle down a little bit because pursuing a surgical career isn't easy. And I did the standard junior doctor jobs, but had developed a fascination for reconstructive surgery back even when I was doing my undergraduate research degree. And I particularly was drawn to complex reconstructive problems and the art of shifting bits of the human body around to other parts of the human body to solve problems. Problems that were generated by various things, trauma, extirpation or excision of tumours, and traumatic injuries and congenital problems as well. And so I sort of progressed in my career, but in parallel was interested in scientific questions related to aspects of reconstructive surgery, and so kind of developed my academic career in parallel, I suppose. So while I was training, I actually was putting the bones of my PhD together and made sort of stepwise progress in both areas. So when I finished my training, I had a FRACS in plastic and reconstructive surgery. So that's the standard Australian surgical qualification. And a year or two, while I was doing a fellowship in Melbourne, I completed my PhD as well.
Congratulations. Okay, fantastic background. The PhD is a research PhD, is that correct?
That's correct. It was a bona fide University of Queensland Doctor of Philosophy qualification. There's lots of different ways, of course, getting a PhD, but for me, it was a thesis by publication. So my thesis had 9 chapters, of which about 6 got published in peer-reviewed journals. So that was how I got the qualification. Drawn out over the maximum possible time for a PhD student. I almost got chucked off the program because I was so slow in getting it finished.
Michael, so some of the surgical work you're doing right now is extraordinary, and you're working in the public sector. So can you tell us something about the work you're doing right now?
Yeah. As I mentioned, being drawn to complex reconstructive problems, there's actually quite a few specific contexts that I've explored both in my clinical work and in my research work. And one key feature of that is bone defects. And they arise in lots of different parts of the human body. And the craniofacial skeleton, you can be missing large segments of skull, jawbone, and then in the lower limb, it's a common and vexing problem to have large segment bone defects of load-bearing limbs. And whilst I was sort of delving into the conventional plastic surgery reconstructive aspects of that, one has, conversations in the operating room with mentors, and in parallel, I was developing a relationship with a pure science researcher. So we were using animal models to explore various aspects of 3D printed devices using novel scientific, materials. And, over the professor's dinner table one night, I had the crazy idea that we should manipulate, the tissue that gets thrown away from the animal in creating the bony defect in such a way as to wrap it around the implant material we were using to effectively bring the implant to life. And that was the concept. It's like, we use lots of implants. We really should be working towards reducing the risks associated with long-term implantation of a medical device by making the devices much more an intrinsic part of the human being.
So do you make it autologous? Is that what you're saying? The device
Essentially,
becomes... Okay.
the principle,
So
and look, materials science is amazing. So we've now reached a point where we can produce medical devices in materials that are bioresorbable. And what that means is they sort of dissolve, and not only do they dissolve, but their byproducts are also completely excreted, like as water or carbon dioxide. And then what's left in their place when they resorb is the actual tissue that was missing in the first place. So it may be bone, or it may be soft tissue fat, you know. That's the concept that I've been developing for the last 15 years.
So you've been working on bone graft? Is
Yep.
one of the many things?
Correct.
That's interesting.
Correct. Graft, the term graft, generally in my world refers to shifting around a tissue, but not really paying much attention to its blood supply. And that will allow you to get away with a certain volume of tissue. And it's not quite that, because what you want to be doing is transplant large volumes of tissue from one part of the body to another, but keep it alive. And the way to do that is to ensure that it's connected to a blood supply, which relies on microsurgical techniques, which is right in the wheelhouse of a plastic surgeon. But, you know, the term graft is not strictly speaking incorrect, because other disciplines will use it. Say, in the context of organ transplantation, we refer to a transplanted kidney as a graft. So it's a source of much confusion. And I guess...
Which areas of the body do you specialize in?
As a plastic and reconstructive surgeon, pretty much all of them. There aren't many parts of the body that we don't, you know, have some involvement with, and it's often, you know, thought that plastic surgeons probably have to have a better grasp of anatomy than most for that reason. But look, you know, we don't operate directly on brain or spinal cord or the eye itself, certainly not any of the internal organs, but just about everything else.
Okay, fascinating. And you've got two institutions that you've kicked off in Australia. Could you say something about those?
Yes, indeed. So as my sort of academic career developed, and I saw a real need as the technology in 3D printing improved to be able to provide 3D printed medical devices at the point of care. So that's in the hospital environment. This is something that didn't really exist when I first started thinking about this. At least it didn't exist in Australia. So with not much money and a lot of enthusiasm, I managed to set up an organisation, a small-scale organisation at the Princess Alexandra Hospital called the Australian Centre for Complex Integrated Surgical Solutions. And that organisation has grown fairly significantly over the past 5 years, to the point where now we're making like in excess of 500 medical devices a year for patients and the surgeons who are looking after them. And these are things that assist with problems of visualization, measurement, and to a lesser extent, tissue replacement, because that really requires high-risk medical devices. Now, that organisation was sort of, as it was succeeding, it was noted at a different hospital in Brisbane that they actually had ambitions to do the same, but on a much bigger scale. So I was approached to establish that organisation. That's the Herston Biofabrication Institute. And I wasn't really prepared to leave one to join another, because I saw much more value in keeping everything connected. As you may know, in Brisbane, the river is wide and deep, and the river runs right through the middle of the city. There's a history of competition between the north and the south side of the river, which is crazy because it's public health, right? It's all the same funding body. So to me, it was really important to keep things connected. So I was happy to take on leadership of both organizations. And when you're still active clinically, which is important to maintain some sort of legitimacy in this space, and running both institutions with a fairly high administrative load, there's just no room for a private practice. So I've been fully committed to public health ever since the day I graduated.
So tell me about the institutions. If someone in Perth needs a mandible, for example, or they need a joint of some kind, do they contact you? Do you then construct it according to the patient's MRI or CT scan?
So we certainly could, but we don't need to, because Perth, as it happens, has an extremely well-developed point-of-care manufacturing service. And in many respects, they were probably a little bit ahead of what we were doing in Brisbane. But look, if we were to say at the hospital where I work, the PA, or indeed any of the hospitals in the catchment area, absolutely, we could work. In fact, I'll give you a better example. I was contacted by a surgeon in Tasmania, which, as you know, is like a long way away from Brisbane, about a particularly complex chest case where there was a hole in the bony part of the chest wall, and there was a big hernia arising from the abdominal contents. We've been able to just get the CT scan images sent up to our imaging system, and we can process the images using our fancy software, and then have a multidisciplinary discussion about what options this patient might have for having the defect corrected, which is obviously going to improve their quality of life, so their functional benefits, but also the cosmetic issues associated as well.
That's interesting. So if you had to rehearse a procedure, or you had to figure out how to make the procedure better, you could actually do it before the procedure.
Oh, most definitely. That is, again, one of the beautiful elements of being able to model stuff in 3D. Is it and there's good evidence to show this, that it instantly improves the communication amongst the surgical team, but also it's particularly beneficial when there are multiple disciplines involved in the complex care of an individual patient, because everybody's in their lane, right? But what we need is for people to be aware of all the lanes around them. We're actually doing one such case tomorrow, where we've got, the anaesthetist needs to understand the issues relating to surgical access around the airway. The spinal surgeon needs a safe corridor to the problem in the neck. The upper GI surgeon needs to be able to see and get to the hole in the esophagus. Then you've got the ear, nose, and throat surgeon who needs to take care of the hole that's higher up in the throat. And then I, as the plastic surgeon, need to come at the end and patch up all the holes and make it all look pretty. So how do you talk about that unless you've got the actual model in front of everyone at the same time?
Okay, that makes a great deal of sense. So I've seen that happen in the UK and France. I've seen where groups of surgeons have sat down and pre-prepared, and it's a very complex surgery.
Yeah.
So
totally.
your work you're doing, what sorts of scientific? I imagine you would have a scientific researcher inside of both institutions.
Yeah.
What sort of work are they doing in pure science?
So this is actually quite interesting, and it forces one to reflect on one's role in science, right? In the development of understanding. So my role has to be quite narrow, and I rely on other people doing the various things they do, so we can progress, knowledge in the area. However, it's important for me to have some understanding of the whole process, as it is for the basic science researcher. So I alluded to one of my close collaborators earlier, right? The basic science areas of importance in this space are material science, which I have no formal training in, engineering, which is how do you build the material to have the mechanical properties that are most representative of the tissues you're trying to simulate. And then not just, ordinary engineering, but bioengineering. So you're thinking about how this is going to interact with biology, which of course feeds into the material science considerations, has to be biocompatible, non-toxic, bioresorbable, as we said. And so then there's tissue engineering as well, which is kind of fusion of biology and engineering. Tissue engineers will try to create small volumes of living tissues that will kind of assemble in a way that represents those tissues. And if that sounds familiar, it should be, because plastic surgery is exactly that, but scaled up. So enter the plastic surgeon. Okay, we've got something, we've developed it in the lab, we've now tried it in animals, we know it works. So you've been part of that animal research. So you start to develop an understanding of how you're actually going to put this in a person to achieve the desired result. So now we get to talking about a thing called the valley of death, right? I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's that massive chasm that sits between a great idea and implementation in a human being, yeah? So historically, lots of great ideas have fallen off the cliff into the valley of death because no one's been able to bring them across, or no entity, I should say, not no one person. And there are complex reasons for that. But this gets back to your original question, I promise. The point of the Institute, HBI, is to help pick those great ideas up once they've been developed in the basic science space, because that requires a lot of expert work, and for us to bring it across the valley of death into, full tilt, regulatory approved, devices that are ready to go. And that basically means running clinical trials, right? So you might do a first in human trial, great idea, new device, let's put it in a person under the right circumstances and see if it actually works. And then you do a phase 1 trial, and then you increase that to phase 2. Then the companies get interested, and they will then run away with it and make sure that it's going to get over the regulatory line, and then it's available to market. So historically, that whole process takes 15 years, sometimes more. And we want to compress it all the way down to 5, 6, 7, depending on the device. That's the challenge.
Have you been selling any intellectual property?
That is a superb question, and a really observant one, Steve. So it's a fascinating area. It's definitely something I've learned a lot about in the last 5 years or so. The short answer to your question is no. But I've learned a lot about the role of intellectual property, right? So in the beginning, the theory with the establishment of the Institute was that if we as a healthcare system just give up all the IP and show no interest in it, just hand it all over, then everyone will come running and they'll want to collaborate, right? Great idea. But it's fundamentally flawed. It's flawed on 2 counts. One, no commercial entity is interested in an idea unless it has IP protection around it already. Because if it's in the public domain, they're like, well, we can't use this at all, right? Why did you not put IP protection around it? So I learned that lesson. And the second lesson is that even commercial entities aside, the academic institutions will fight tooth and nail for IP, right? To death. They will actually go all the way to death for IP. And they will behave badly just to get the IP. So, right. and coincidentally, at the same time, the healthcare system went, hang on a sec, there's money to be made in IP? Well, we should have some of that too. The problem was my healthcare system has zero infrastructure and zero budget to develop IP. So it's a perfect storm, and look, it's been a fun experience, frustrating at times. I think we're starting to get it right because we've got an established relationship with a core academic partner, and we've got an umbrella agreement that sort of acknowledges background IP and how it should be handled, just broadly. And then, I understand now how to get commercial partners, which are the important third part of the triumvirate, involved. I'm getting a better sense for what's worth investing in from an IP point of view and what isn't, but haven't really successfully made any money out of IP yet, and it may take quite some time. When you have a point of care manufacturing facility, right, there's a lot of investment required to get the machines and build the quality management systems and integrate with the clinical services and make sure everything's running sweetly. So you want to make really sure that you're optimizing your investment. And one of the key ways of doing it, so you can't be sitting around just waiting for these complex cases to come along. I kind of learned that when I set up ACCISS. The idea was just to cater to those complex cases, which were going to give you the best value for money, insofar as they would have the best health economic effects, in a sense. But that, we needed the machines to be doing something else, and I didn't have to wait too long or look too hard, but using the skills and the techniques and the knowledge to develop models for education is a really quick, fast-growing area of interest, right? So you can, let's say, and you alluded to this before, it's like surgical rehearsal, but let's take it to the next level. Let's actually print out the bit of the patient that we need to operate on and practice the surgery first, right? Or you could take it further and say, okay, this is a key skill that a clinician needs. It's a high stakes, low frequency procedure, like front of neck access to the airway, right? Anesthetists need to know how to slot a neck to put a tube in the airway to keep someone alive. But how often does that actually happen? Not very. So having high fidelity models that allow the clinicians to practice that skill and preserve their skills for the one moment when it actually happens is really important. And there are lots and lots and lots of examples of exactly that kind of thing all over medicine. So we're catering to that need, and it's a good way of doing good work and also generating a little bit of revenue just to cover some of your other costs. So that's our particular interest. We now make models for all kinds of workshops. We mentioned airway trainers, but also hand fractures, facial fractures, just to get young junior doctors used to the feeling of putting plates and screws in and reducing fractures. We've made kidney models to educate patients who are having kidney transplants. We've made, basic skull models for junior surgeons who need to learn how to drill out the base of skull. Like you name it, there's a model for it. And it's really, really satisfying work.
There was a fantastic product called Regenitin. It's Smith & Nephew purchased it. It's a biologic. Apparently there's a tendon here.
Yes.
I'm led to believe. It's an important tendon. Yes. And it's a biologic that was developed in Australia. They sold it to Smith & Nephew, and it didn't come from a facility like yours. It came from a PhD project. Have you ever thought of working with a lot of the rather remarkable PhD projects that are going on in Australia and partnering with those?
Most definitely. And I guess it gets back to that question of how much do you want to delve into the basic science space? So yeah, there was an attempt, at HBI in particular, to try and be a research institute in this space. It's not a great idea because basic science research and developing that stuff, I think people underestimate exactly how much highly specialized work and money is involved in that. So yeah, the benefit to us as a healthcare institution is to partner up with those people and those organizations, be part of the early part of the research so that we understand it and then translate it. So, and of course it works both ways because the academic institutions have serious gains to make by partnering up with clinicians. It legitimizes their grant applications and it instantly makes them more fundable if you've got a clinician saying, yeah, I will use this, and these are the reasons why it's better than what I currently do. So the answer to your question is absolutely, but we're trying to move a little bit away from some of the super basic science that has to happen in specialized laboratories at the university, but we're still involved in making sure that the ideas that they come up with are truly translatable.
Michael,
but we do employ PhD students.
I think what you've achieved is quite remarkable. I'm very impressed with this story. And I'd like to do this again, perhaps in 6 months' time.
Yeah.
I really am very grateful you've given me your time today. So thank you very much for this. It's very kind of you.
No, it's my absolute pleasure, Stephen.
Take care.
Take care. Bye.